Hey guys, welcome to Man Medicine, where we talk about how men can optimize their health and escape the collapsing U.S. healthcare system. We're going through a little drama in my house right now. My 2-year-old, and we're trying to wean him off his pacifier. The binky, as he calls it, my binky. You know, honestly, I regret getting him hooked on his binky. But, you know, at the time, my wife and I were like, we were completely desperate. My son, I love him to death. He's a terrible sleeper. He's kind of irritable. This was like the one thing that kind of like allowed him to calm himself down and settle down and at least sleep for a little while, because we were just getting killed like the first year and a half of this little guy's life. It was just one bad night after the other. But the binky, it did seem to help. So I think, like a lot of parents, you know, I started off with this idea like, no, we're not gonna use the pacifier. We're gonna let him figure out how to like self-soothe himself and, you know, work through it. We'll address whatever issues are bothering him. Yeah, well, you know, then reality comes in and you get a colicky kid, and this is the only thing that works. And you work in 10-hour shifts at a trauma center, and you got to sleep, and you got like 2 hours before you have to wake up. Anyway, you end up resorting to whatever you have to resort to you know, for yourself, basically for your own sanity. But is it really in the best interest of the child? I mean, I'm not a child development expert, but you know, now at the age 2, he won't go anywhere without that thing. And you know, it's not a big deal when your 6-month-old or your 9-month-old has a pacifier, but he's like over 2 now, so it's not a good look anymore. I think in all of our family photos, he's got his binky in his mouth. But yeah, he's resisting us removing it. And you know what? This whole thing kind of got me chuckling a little bit. It's not that different from guys on TRT who are using aromatase inhibitors, okay? I know it sounds crazy, but just hear me out. It's very common in the early stages of TRT for a man to experience some adverse side effects. Nipple itchiness, puffiness, bloating, maybe some mood swings and irritability. You know, that does happen. And it's very common, very, very common, especially at their initial follow-up, if not right out of the gate. It's very common for inexperienced providers who don't truly understand what's going on, who maybe don't understand some of the more deeper pathophysiology of what's going on, to go for the quick fix. They deploy an Estradiol. This is an Estradiol, okay? And you know what? It makes the nipple itchiness and puffiness, oftentimes, it makes it go away. Some of the fluid retention, the cankles that these guys get, seems to get a little bit better. But then they're stuck. Then they're on this AI for life, it seems. And they become very, very resistant to giving it up. And, you know, I've talked till I'm basically blue in the face, and many, many, many really good providers out there who've been doing this even longer than I have experienced the same thing. It's a very tough nut to crack to convince a patient that not only do you not need to block estradiol, but estradiol is, in almost all cases, extraordinarily beneficial. It is the source of many, 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 if not, I'm not going to say all, many of the positive effects of TRT are mediated through the conversion of testosterone into estradiol by the aromatase enzyme. And this is not something that we want to block in virtually all cases. It's there. I'm leery about using the terms always and never in the world of medicine. This will be 25 years coming up this year that I've been in practice. And you know what? There's always going to be an exception out there. For the vast, 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 vast majority of guys, controlling estradiol via an aromatase inhibitor, while it might seem like a good short-term solution, the binky, it's a terrible long-term solution. It's actually harmful. If you're one of those guys who is just adamant about the fact that you need to control your estradiol, that you need to see that number go down, you need to take something to do that. Okay, you know, again, I'm not here to tell you to do anything. If you want to take an AI, go ahead and take an AI. But I'm going to present you with an alternative AI today that perhaps maybe you haven't thought about. In fact, you know, a lot of people accuse me of being completely anti, and I'm going to show you today that that's not true. There's an AI that I've been prescribing for almost 25 years now on a regular basis. For a large part of that, I didn't know that it was an AI. To be fair, I was prescribing it for other reasons. But I'm going to throw it out there for your consideration, because quite honestly, I think anastrozole is a terrible drug. All of the aromatase inhibitors, these are breast breast cancer, chemotherapy drugs. They're very harsh. They have some pathophysiological properties which make me a bit uncomfortable, and that I'll talk about a little bit. And ultimately, they don't get at the root issue. You know, everybody complains doctors just put a Band-Aid on things. They don't get to the root cause of things. Well, listen, if a provider just starts you on an Estradiol, that's one of those providers, right? They have not analyzed the root cause of why you're having the issues that you're having. So be wary of that. Anyway, guys develop these symptoms. They may have water retention as well. Invariably, at their follow-up, their provider will draw a series of labs. This will include an estradiol. And of course, because they're on therapeutic TRT, that estradiol level will be above the reference range. So there it is in bold letters, in red ink, with an H by it for high. So it stands out immediately. So, of course, the provider and the patient, their eyes are drawn to that number. That's the reason you're having all of these symptoms. And they're mistaken. That is part of the issue. Okay, estradiol is involved tangentially in all of these issues, but not in the way that they think. Again, we'll talk a little bit. I don't want to do a deep dive on estradiol here. I've got other videos on that. And again, on YouTube, there's also some excellent videos on estradiol. If you go to the TRT and hormone optimization YouTube channel, they've beat this to death. They've got a fantastic collection of videos there where this is discussed in painful detail if you guys need to know a little bit more. But I'm going to touch on it here. I'm going to give you my spin on it as well. Let's talk about checking estradiol levels real quick. And I will tell you in my clinical practice, I don't check these unless a patient requests them. If they request them, it's fine if you just want to know. But there's a reason I do that. And again, I've talked about this in more detail in other videos, but the serum estradiol is not a great reflection of what's going on in the tissues. So estradiol and also DHT are intracrine or paracrine hormones, meaning they are produced inside the cell. They are utilized inside the cell and perhaps around with some of the local tissues adjacent to those cells. They're not designed to be ejected out into the bloodstream and then transported all over the body to be used over there, you know, where they're being used. Unlike testosterone, which is, right? It's made in the testicles only, the exception of a little bit in the adrenal glands. And then it goes out into the serum and it goes out to the rest of the body. So the organs of the body don't make their own testosterone, all right? They rely on the testosterone from your testes, right? Which is why if you lose your testicles, you lose your testosterone. With estradiol, it's made in all the tissues. So the aromatase enzyme, you have aromatase in your brain. You have very high levels of aromatase in your brain. You have it in your heart. You have it in your liver. You have it in your fat tissue, especially your visceral fat tissue. So many, maybe not all, but many tissues, if not most tissues in the body, they contain the aromatase enzyme. So the testosterone that's circulating, it gets converted into estradiol at the local level. It's used at the local level. And then whatever is left over, whatever is not used, it leaches out into the serum, and that's what you're able to measure. Okay, so you're not really measuring what's going on in the tissues. And, you know, if you don't believe me, this is a really good paper that I think if you're in this space, or if you're just, you know, more interested in learning a lot, or if you're interested in learning a lot more about this, it's a fantastic paper, Mechanisms in Endocrinology. It's called Estradiol as a Male Hormone by doctors Nicholas Russell and then Matthias Grossman, MD, PhD. So these are very bright guys, MD, PhDs, who have dedicated their lives to the study of endocrinology hormones. And they've written an excellent paper here about the role of estradiol. And I'm actually going to highlight a paragraph here. I bring this up quite a bit because they can explain this much more elegantly than I can. So this is what these two esteemed physicians have to say. Okay, I'm just going to read it for you. At present, serum E2 measurement should not be part of the routine evaluation of clinical conditions such as hypogonadism or osteoporosis. Why? Because there is no evidence that E2 measurements provide clinically actionable information beyond that of circulating testosterone. Access to validated gold standard mass spec E2 measurement techniques for routine clinical use is still limited for many clinicians. That's true. It's getting a bit better. I know in the US you can get mass spec tests, you know, relatively easily. It's still limited for many clinicians, and measurement by immunoassay, which is the other way to measure this, is highly inaccurate and tends to overestimate E2 levels at the low serum concentrations present in men. So, when your provider orders like total estrogens, that's what they're getting, and it's totally useless. Totally useless. But as he argues here, even LCMS is relatively useless as well. So, finishes out by saying, even if circulating E2 can be accurately measured, because E2 in men is produced locally and diffusely in aromatase-containing tissues, like I just explained, and acts in a paracrine fashion, okay, meaning that it's used by the cell that makes it, and then some of the adjacent cells within that tissue. Okay, it's not designed to go out into the rest of the body. It is unclear to what extent serum E2 concentrations reflect sufficiency of estrogenic effects in any particular tissue. Okay, so you've got a estradiol level of 50, and you go and see your provider, and they're like, "Oh dear God, you're outside of the reference range. Let's put you on an anastrozole. Put you on 0.5 milligram of anastrozole, once a week." Okay, great. So now, now your serum level, I don't know, let's say your serum level's 35 now, or it's 30. It's 30 in the blood for most of the week. If you're taking this AI once a week, it's going to vary. You have no idea what your estradiol level is in the tissues that need it the most. Because remember, the aromatase enzyme, it exists inside the tissues. So you may have absolutely crushed your estradiol levels within the cells that actually need it, and those cells are suffering the deleterious effects of low estradiol, even though your serum level is quote normal. Okay, so it's a bit of game of Russian roulette. You just don't know what's going on, and it's very likely because of variations in aromatase enzyme concentration, various polymorphisms and distribution throughout various tissues, that in fact, a given dose of anastrozole will produce widely variable declines in estradiol depending on the particular tissue that you're looking at. So the brain may be much more affected than the liver, than the heart, than the kidneys. You'll get different levels in all of those tissues based off even with a single dose or a single standardized dose of anastrozole. And some of those tissues may be in the ballpark of what's going on in the serum, but many of them will not be. They will be completely off. They'll be completely off, and you cannot predict what that's going to be. And that opens the door to all sorts of potential, not just short-range side effects, but it's the long-range side effects that I worry about, particularly in bone and in the cardiovascular system and the brain. So those, you don't want to mess with those, because once you've developed damage in those, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to reverse that. So you may be feeling okay year after year, you're taking your AI. But meanwhile, now you're accelerating vascular disease. You're accelerating some unfavorable remodeling in the microvasculature of the heart, perhaps also in the brain. You just don't know. You just don't know. So best not to mess with it. And again, this paper here lays it out. You should not be routinely checking estradiol levels if you're a provider. And as a patient, I know you want to check everything. I'm a numbers guy too. I like numbers, but this is not a number that is what I call a decision node. What I mean by that is, if you want to be a purist, if you're going to, you only order a lab test if it's going to change your management. If it's a decision node, the decision you make is going to hinge on that number. So if a guy comes up to me and is like, I have a serum estradiol level, high sensitivity LCMS of 50, I don't know what to do with that. I'm like, okay, congratulations. Like, how do you feel? Great. It's not a decision node. It's not a decision node at all. I need a lot more information than that. So that's how I feel about this. Feel free to disagree. Again, there's a whole crowd out there that they can't let go of this, and that's okay, because I can't let go of this either. But I feel like I'm making this decision based off of at least a fair amount of literature support. So let's move on a little bit. We'll talk a little bit more here about estradiol. I promise you, I will tell you about this new and amazing AI that you all have actually probably heard of already. You just maybe didn't know that it was an AI. Okay, so there's another fear when guys that perhaps like to run super physiologic amounts of testosterone, or let's just say I hear guys call it TRT plus, all right? So you're taking a little more TRT than perhaps you need to resolve your symptoms of hypogonadism. And, maybe you're doing that for physique purposes, maybe for some of the mental aspects of it. I don't know. Whatever the reason is, you're taking I don't know, 250, 300 milligrams of testosterone. there's a fear that the more, we know that testosterone goes to estradiol. So the more testosterone I take, the more estradiol I'm gonna develop. So shit, I better take an AI. Okay. Well, that's true to a limited extent. There's something called Michaelis-Menten kinetics. This is something we learned way back in, even in undergrad biochemistry. You learn about it again in medical school and in your pharmacology. And what that basically means is that there is a saturation point to an enzyme or to a chemical reaction. Something like A goes to B. Well, you can drive that reaction faster and you can produce more B from A initially by adding in more substrate, more A. The more A I put in, the more B I get out the other end. But there is a limit. That machinery that churns out the bees, it can only go so fast, right? So there comes a point where you can saturate that reaction and I can continue to add more A and I'm not going to get more B out the end. So two great examples of that are in the human body are estradiol and DHT. So here's a little curve here. This is exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to DHT. So on the bottom, you have testosterone concentrations, and on the left, the y-axis here, you have serum DHT. So in the beginning, like, look, when we go from 0 testosterone to like 40, it's like straight up, right? The more T I'm putting in, the more DHT I'm getting out. Okay, it makes sense. But check this out. Now we're going to go from 40 to 60. Oh, it starts to level out a little bit. So, I've doubled the amount of testosterone, but I'm not doubling the output of DHT here. And then now, we'll go from, I don't know, we'll go from 100 to 120. I mean, it's negligible, right? So this is what happens with DHT, and it's exactly what happens with estradiol, okay? And again, if you want to read a little bit more about this, there is this article here, The Effects of Injected Testosterone Dose and Age on the Conversion of Testosterone to Estradiol and dihydrotestosterone in young and older men. So they took a bunch of young guys, I think it was 19 to 35, group of old guys, whether age 59 to 75, and they gave them various doses of testosterone after wiping out their endogenous testosterone. And they started off with like really low doses, like 25 a week of enanthate, testosterone enanthate, all the way up to 600 milligrams of testosterone enanthate. And a couple of things are interesting about this. One, it followed the exact same curve here. Putting in more testosterone resulted in more estradiol at low concentrations. But as you start to add more testosterone, you don't necessarily get more estradiol. It kind of flattens out, okay? So for example, in the age 19 to 35 group, if you had a total testosterone of 800, the average E2 was 29.0. So right at the upper limits of the reference range, okay? But if you were an old guy, if you're over 49, then the average estradiol was 48.7. Again, totally normal, right? But way outside of the reference range. So if you're a 59-year-old guy and you've got a total testosterone of 800 and you go to your clinic and your estradiol is 48.7, well, congratulations, you're completely normal. That's what we expect it to be, okay? That doesn't require an AI, all right? Now, let's double the total T. So we double our total testosterone. Now it's 1600, okay? In the young guys, now you're at your E2 level, the average for guys in the 19 to 35 group, it was 45. Okay, so it goes up, right? And then if you're over age 59, it's 72.1. So it's going to be higher in the older guys. So again, if you're an older guy and you're running total T levels of 1600, it's entirely within the norm to have an estradiol level of 72.1, a serum estradiol of 72.1. If you're a young guy, if you're 28 years old and you're on TRT and you're running, a little super physiologic at 1600, your estradiol should be 45. Now, your mileage may vary, right, based on certain medical conditions. We'll talk about that in a second. And, aromatase polymorphisms do exist, right? Some men do have, high sensitivity, highly efficient aromatase enzymes. Perhaps they'll be able to tolerate and make more estradiol. Some people may have inefficient aromatase enzymes and maybe they're going to make a little bit less estradiol. But average for a total T of 1600 is 45. So there you go. It's a good paper. This one's been around a while. It's Yeah, Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism, 2010. Okay, we've talked about the typical scenario, right? The guy that comes in, he gets started on TRT and then begins experiencing the symptoms that I mentioned earlier. We need to dig a little bit deeper in this, right? The problem is not necessarily estradiol. The problem is not necessarily estradiol. I'm going to show you that here in a second. So, I've been at this long enough, and I think most of the providers out here that have been treating TRT patients for a really, really long time, they can kind of predict who's going to get these, quote, high estrogen symptoms, almost as soon as they walk in the door, and certainly after doing some labs and a good history and physical exam. Okay, who are these guys? These are men who are obese. Okay, you guys are fat. You're insulin resistant. You have not just a large amount of subcutaneous body fat, but you carry a lot of visceral body fat, which is particularly toxic. Okay, you are inflamed, meaning you have high inflammatory markers chronically, almost always from high amounts of visceral body fat. This includes fatty liver disease, major contributor to this. So these guys have metabolic syndrome, right? They tend to have on their lipids, they'll have triglyceride elevations, they'll have low HDL, and in many cases may have high, either moderate or elevated LDL-C levels and ApoB. If you do fasting insulin levels on them, their fasting insulin will be up, and they will have a pre-diabetic range hemoglobin A1. Those guys, I hate to say it, those guys are a dime a dozen, and that is a large percentage of the population that seeks out TRT clinics. But listen, that group of people, that group of men especially, guys, that's actually the norm now. So based on 2018 data, this is, I've known this for a while, but this, like, every time I say this, it still just shocks me. 63% of American men are either diabetic, meaning type 2, full-blown type 2s, or pre-diabetic. So almost 2/3 of the population, okay, is either diabetic or pre-diabetic. So let that sink in. Is it any surprise that these men are suffering from low testosterone? They are metabolic dumpster fires when they walk into the door of the TRT clinic. And it's not surprising that those are exactly the kind of men who, when they receive their first bolus of testosterone, are going to have a hard time. They are not metabolically prepared to turn the clock back, if it ever was turned back, to a testosterone level of, say, 1200. They cannot handle that, and they're going to experience all the side effects that we've talked about previously. It's a sign, again, of an inexperienced provider, in my opinion, that takes somebody like that and just like floods them with high doses of testosterone. And this is why many of these clinics, there's a reason they do 200 milligrams of testosterone cypionate and 1 milligram of anastrozole right out of the gate. Okay, this is the reason. This is the reason, because they know that these guys are not going to, they are not prepared to handle the rocket fuel that they get, and they're going to get side effects. And so they offset that. I should say they put a Band-Aid on it. They stick the binky in the baby's mouth to quiet the baby and to cover up the symptoms that these men are experiencing. But they're really not doing them any favors in the long. Now, I know there's going to be a whole bunch of you guys out there that are like, I'm not obese. Yet I still have all these high E2 symptoms. I have a high serum estradiol. If there's one thing that is consistent among men, is that they consistently underestimate their body fat percentage, and they overestimate how good they are in a street fight. So those two things. All right. These guys look at themselves in the mirror. I see it all the time on the forum. I'm a 35-year-old male, with this, I'll say, like, relatively lean, and I look at their picture, and it's this big dough face with a double chin. Now, they might be kind of thin, so they might have that sort of skinny fat phenotype, but they're carrying way too much body fat. Remember, guys, a body fat percentage, according to NIH data, of 25% or higher is considered obese. All right, 25%, like the average American male is around 27 to 28%. So the average, if you just look around and you're like, oh, I'm not that great, but I'm pretty average. Well, congratulations, you are obese. And the thing you need to know is that a body fat percentage, again, this is all according to NIH data. If you look at rates of metabolic syndrome, which is exactly what we're talking about here, high triglycerides, insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, low HDL, poor lipids, increased risk of cardiovascular disease, etc. It starts over a body fat percentage of 23%. 23. it's fourfold higher than below 23%. So maybe we should even lower it down to 23%. So even if so you're walking around at 23%, trust me, that's too high. That's high enough in certain men to cause these quote high E2 symptoms. And again, certainly most doctors are above 23% themselves. So of course they're not going to bat an eye at it. Even many trainers would be like, oh, well, you're not doing too bad. You're doing okay. But the fact of the matter is, at 23% and above, your risk starts going up for metabolic syndrome. It is not healthy to walk around for the majority of men. It's not healthy to be at 23% body fat. Ideal body fat, people argue about this. It's probably around 11 or 12%, in order to be perfectly ideal. I tell my guys, I would love to get you between 11 and 15%. That's generally the sweet spot. That's going to be difficult. Okay. Again, the men that walk into these TRT clinics, the 2/3 of men that are diabetic or pre-diabetic, it's been my experience. I see 30% body fat percentages, 30% all the time, 30% plus all the time. 1/3 of their body mass is fat. So, the way I look at it now is it should not be surprising, right? If you dump 200 milligrams of testosterone cypionate in somebody who is 1/3 fat, it's going to wreak havoc. They're going to have these quote high estrogen symptoms. It's very common. I see it all the time. And that's why I'm a bit more judicious with things. I like to look a little bit deeper at the pathophysiology and see if I can preempt some of this using, some of the things we'll talk about here in a second and things I've talked about in other videos. In my opinion, there's many ways to handle that. Again, I'm not going to go into exquisite detail here because I've done it so many times in other videos, but the first thing is look at the protocol, right? Generally, like bolusing large doses of testosterone where you have huge peaks and troughs, generally not a good idea. Generally breaking up injections, lower doses out of the gate until the men can do what they need to do to get their body fat down, improve their metabolic health. ACE inhibitors and ARBs go a long way in terms of treating fluid retention. They're much better at treating the root cause. Okay, one of the reasons that people get better with fluid retention on an AI is that there is a transient increased sensitivity to ADH, antidiuretic hormone, with elevated levels of estradiol. So antidiuretic hormone, as you can probably figure out from the name, it causes fluid retention. But here's the thing, if you just wait it out, it goes away. It set point resets and the estradiol doesn't have that effect. So you don't want to be taking away one of the most beneficial hormones that there are in the human body for a male and for a female for a transient fluid issue it's going to self-regulate and go away. You can speed that up. And you can also give people some additional cardiovascular benefits by using ACE inhibitors and ARBs, things like telmisartan, the lisinopril, all those things that are out there. And I am very liberal with those. I hand those out, not quite like candy, but I do distribute them quite a bit. And then, fat loss. Fat loss is the cornerstone of, if you want to solve these symptoms, you have to get lean. And I would tell guys, listen, do you want to solve your quote estrogen problem? You can take a female breast cancer chemotherapy drug for the next 50 years. Or you know what? You can work with me, you can work with someone else and get your shit together, okay, and work yourself down to sub 20% body fat, ideally closer to 15%, and then you don't need any of this stuff. Like, what do you think is the better option, right? This, when you put it that way, to me, it just becomes like glaringly obvious, all right? Nobody wants to raise their hand and be like, I want the breast cancer chemo drug and I want to stay a fat piece of what for the next 50 years and just take my testosterone and not have any problems. But you are going to have problems. You're going to have early cardiovascular disease. You're going to develop type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, all the things that we see when you suppress estradiol for long periods of time. So I would encourage you to consider weight loss and the building up of as much lean muscle tissue as you can before the age of 50, as I've talked about in other videos. That's the way you take care of this. But I get it. Some of you guys are like, Dr. Winge, you're full of shit. You don't know what you're talking about. Estradiol is important, man. I got to control it. If I don't control my estradiol, I have all these problems. I am lean. Okay, maybe you are. All right, I got something for you. So this is the only AI that I will ever recommend for you guys, okay? And that is called Metformin. You didn't know metformin was an AI, did you? Well, it's not exactly an AI like anastrozole. So anastrozole, blocks the aromatase enzyme from converting estradiol into testosterone. Okay, it also blocks androstenedione from going into estrone. Okay, less known pathway, but what metformin does in ovarian and breast tissue, we know this is all from breast cancer research, is that it actually like regulates the actual production at the DNA level of the aromatase enzyme. So you could argue that it's actually superior. It actually reduces the amount of aromatase that's present in the tissue itself. Rather than just blocking the aromatase and leaving it intact, you actually create less aromatase when you have metformin on board. And this was discovered, it's been looked at for a number of different years, but this has been discovered, a number of years ago, and it's absolutely validated in a number of breast cancer studies in vitro and in vivo. And these are just two of them right here. So here we have the effect of metformin versus placebo on sex hormones in Canadian cancer trials, group MA.32. I'm not sure what that is. This is from the National Cancer Institute Journal 2021. And what they saw here is over the course of 6 months, women with breast cancer treated with metformin, so they dropped their serum estradiol levels. Where was it? By 5.7 picomoles per liter. Okay, so they had a decline. More impressively, in this particular study, this is a randomized controlled trial, clinical breast cancer in 2013, December. So metformin decreases circulating androgen and estrogen levels in non-diabetic women with breast cancer, because that's always been a question with metformin, right? I mean, we know it has all these great benefits in people with diabetes and prediabetes, but does it do anything in people who are non-diabetic? And the jury's still out on much of that in terms of life extension and stuff. But here, in this particular study, non-diabetic women, so they took 1,500 milligrams per day of metformin. They dropped their serum estradiol levels by 38%. 38% in this study. So a little less than the first one, but up to 38% here. Super interesting, right? Super, super interesting. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of the mechanisms. So this is Breast Cancer Research and Treatment 2010. Metformin inhibits aromatase expression in human breast adipose stromal cells via stimulation of the AMP-activated protein kinase. Trust me, we're not going to go into what an AMP protein kinase is. You guys can look it up if you want to. But this is where they start looking into, the actual mechanism. And it says it here in the title. It inhibits aromatase expression. Okay, the actual synthesis of the enzyme itself, which again is a slightly different mechanism than things like anastrozole. So, in this particular study, they took cells in a petri dish and they incubated them with metformin, with insulin, or with a combination of metformin and insulin. And then they measured the aromatase mRNA expression, which is measures the synthesis of the mRNA enzyme, and then they also measured estrogen levels as well. Okay, so here's how they think metformin works. So this is a picture of the aromatase gene, okay, and it has all these little boxes here, these different regions along the gene that are called promoters. And when something binds or activates that promoter, it promotes the synthesis of the DNA that's encoded in that particular area. And what they have found is that metformin, it downregulates these promoters, but not all of them. So it downregulates promoter 2, 1.3, and 1.4. I know that's kind of meaningless, but 1.4, so let me back up. Promoter 2 and promoter 1.3 are heavily expressed in abnormal cells like breast cancer cells, which is why there may be some benefit with metformin in patients who have breast cancer. 1.4, though, is found in normal breast tissue. Okay, I bring that up because, again, one of the big fears of these high estradiol levels in men who also have this exact same aromatase enzyme in their breast tissue, it has the same 1.4 promoter gene area it has the same promoter region, 1.4, on the gene, same in men as it is in women. And this is in normal breast tissue. And metformin silences that promoter, and that's how it inhibits the synthesis of the aromatase enzyme. So this is a very powerful little table here. So this is what they found. Aromatase mRNA expression, so on the y-axis, and then we looked at what happens under various test conditions. So these cells, the control group left to their own devices, will produce the aromatase enzyme at a certain rate, basal rate, they call it 1.0. When you put metformin in there, look, it shuts it down. Those cells, they stop producing the aromatase enzyme. It's done. Now, we'll take the control cells and we'll add in insulin, okay, which is a known promoter of aromatase enzyme synthesis. Okay, why do I emphasize that? Again, guys, this is the root cause here, right? So the reason the fat, insulin resistant, hyperinsulinemic, metabolically unhealthy man develops higher levels of estradiol that he attributes all of his symptoms to is because of hyperinsulinemia, right? The insulin is driving not the production of estradiol directly, it's driving the synthesis of the aromatase enzyme itself. So what if you have a high insulin state, you're churning out aromatase, and now we throw some metformin in there. Look, boom, it's crushed. It cancels out the effects of the hyperinsulinemia. So you tell me, would it be smarter if you're a fat, hyperinsulinemic dude and you don't like your high estradiol number? Would it make more sense to take anastrozole and block the production, or would it make more of estradiol, or would it make more sense to take metformin, which is good for you in many other ways we'll talk about, and actually block the production of the aromatase enzyme itself? Okay, and not to mention, again, reap all of the potential benefits that metformin could bring you, especially if you're pre-diabetic or full-blown diabetic. I mean, dude, I don't know. That seems like a no-brainer to me. Okay, sign me up for the metformin, and you can take back your anastrozole. All right, and this kind of goes along with it. So here on the y-axis, we have estrogen levels and picomoles, and then similar groups here. So again, the control group, it produces a certain amount of estrogen, as you would expect, right? We throw metformin in there, boom, okay, now we're making it tougher, we're producing less estradiol. So now we have our overweight, hyperinsulinemic, metabolic syndrome guy with elevated estradiol levels that he thinks are ruining his life. And he has these high insulin levels. He's cranking out even more estrogen because of the insulin. Okay, the insulin is driving the production of the aromatase enzyme. We put him on metformin. Look at this, boom, you bring it right down. Okay, now almost as low as if he was not hyperinsulinemic. Pretty close. Guys, it's a no-brainer. Sign me up for the metformin and you can take your anastrozole back. The clinic won't like it because anastrozole, they can charge more money for anastrozole, and metformin is pennies. So they may not like it. You might have to go out on your own and get it. All right. So super interesting, right? Like, I found this to be fascinating when I first learned about this. And so how do I manage these, quote, high E2 symptoms in these guys? I mean, it's not with anastrozole. I mean, metformin is right up there in my armamentarium. It's first line. Obviously, many guys with low T that I see are pre-diabetic or on the cusp of becoming pre-diabetic, and so metformin is kind of a no-brainer. I mean, it is FDA approved for pre-diabetes. It drastically lowers the chance of progression from pre-diabetes to diabetes. Has another potential benefits in the longevity space. We're still kind of working that out. It is an mTOR inhibitor, right? Much weaker than rapamycin. So it may, and I emphasize may, have some anti-aging properties. We just don't know yet. So there's ongoing studies about this, but massively better for you if you have to take a drug for your elevated estradiol levels. It makes a lot more sense to me to choose metformin in addition to some of the other meds I talked about earlier to manage side effects than it absolutely does to take anastrozole. It's a terrible drug. I don't encourage anybody to take it unless you have estrogen receptor positive breast cancer, which, men do get. Although thankfully it's really rare. So, I know this study is not perfect. I would love to see this study, replicated some way in men. This was in female or with female tissue. Listen, the aromatase enzyme is the same. the pathophysiology is the same in men and women. And I'll tell you, in clinical practice, I've seen it work in precisely the same way. And the few times I do check estradiol levels, they tend to go down in these guys when they start metformin. Okay. Now, they're also doing all of the other stuff. Anybody that works with me is required to be on a diet and exercise program. And if they need it, they're helped along the way with weight loss. So it's hard to tell, is it the metformin? Is it the weight loss? It's everything. But that is the cornerstone to managing this. It's improving metabolic health. That's how you, long term, you fix these, quote, high E2 symptoms, which are really not high E2. They're largely due to hyperinsulinemia, elevated unfavorable adipokines, which are secreted by visceral body fat. Okay, that's all I got for you guys today. It's a quick one. I got to actually go off to work again. So I'd love to hear what you think. I know there's controversy out there. I know there's guys that are going to be like shaking their fist and be mad, because I want to take away your AI. I don't want to take away your AI. I do want to take away my son's pacifier, though. So if you have any tips, any parental tips on how to go about doing that, I am all ears, because let me just tell you, it's not going well so far. We'll get it figured out. Anyway, I hope you guys are doing well, and I will catch you next time. Bye-bye.
All Man Medicine video and audio has been created and shared online for informational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute the practice of medicine or professional healthcare services of any kind, including the giving of medical advice. I am not your doctor. No doctor-patient relationship has been established. This content is not meant to be a substitute for professional medical advice and should not be relied upon solely for that purpose either. The only purpose of this content is to present peer-reviewed, research-backed health information for your consideration. As always, rely on the advice and guidance of your personal physician before undertaking any activity presented here, and if in doubt or not comfortable with said activity, practice discretion. Your health is your responsibility and not ours. Finally, I take conflicts of interest seriously. I accept no compensation whatsoever from any private corporations, including pharmaceutical or supplement companies. You can trust that if I recommend a medication, product, or service, it's because I genuinely believe in it and not because I'm being paid to endorse it.